and select if you wish to submit anonymously. When submitting a question, please ensure that you state who the question is for. 2, state your question and provide your name and country or post anonymously. The ITF Parents Educational Support Strategy has been launched in partnership with Loughborough University from the UK and the Lawn Tennis Association to assist parents in helping their children in their tennis involvement. This strategy is based on a collaborative framework. The main topics covered during this workshop will include knowledge of tennis, the reasons for involvement, some organizational aspects, and talent development. The strategy is grounded upon research, which has examined the education and support tennis parents want and need at different stages of their child involvement. This webinar provides information to parents of tennis players existing or new to the game, as well as any tennis coaches who wish to learn more dealing with children in competitive environments, whether a parent of a beginner, intermediate, advanced or high performance player, or as their respective coaches. This webinar will be useful for you. This webinar will be introduced deterring parents to the education and support strategy of the ITF, and leading research expert in tennis parent education, such as Dr. Sam Thrower from Roehampton University in the UK, and Professor Chris Harwood from Loughborough University in the UK, will provide an overview of the key components included in 2 purposely designed ITF tennis parents workshops and supporting online courses. As stated during the webinar, please post any questions to our 2 experts following the steps indicated. You can find more online courses in the ITF Academy. We suggest you take them to know more. Finally, the ITF and the National Tennis Associations will also deliver virtual and face-to-face workshops that complete the content presented in each course. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers today, Professor Chris Harwood and Dr. Sam Thrower. Both are experts in the research of parents of tennis players. Both Chris and Sam have been working together, conducting a series of workshops for the British LTA and remain involved in the delivery of this education pathway within the British tennis education system. Chris and Sam is a full professor of sports psychology at Loughborough University in the UK and a registered sports psychologist who has worked with coaches, players, parents, and organizations in tennis for over 25 years. His expertise lies within the psychology of youth sport, and he's particularly known for conducting practical research within sports parents and coaches that aim to support the health, well-being, and development of young athletes. Chris will be sharing an overview of the second ITF Tennis Parent Workshop, Optimal Competition Parenting Workshop. Dr. Sam Thrower is a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Roehampton and a chartered psychologist with the British Psychological Society. He has been researching and working with sport parents for 8 years and is particularly interested in parent-child interactions and evaluating the effectiveness of a sports parent education programs. Sam will be introducing the core components included within the first ITF Tennis Parent Workshop, Junior Tennis, and Introduction for Parents. To start, I would like to introduce Dr. Sam Thrower. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Miguel. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to start by saying how great it is to see so many people on the call this evening. It always reinforces the importance of the work that we do alongside the ITF in terms of educating and supporting parents. My job this afternoon is really to introduce the first workshop, But before I do that, I wanted to start by emphasizing with the challenges that you face as tennis parents. Chris and I have been working in this area for around 10 years now. And some of Chris's very early work in this area really focused on the challenges that parents face across different developmental stages. And when you read that paper, it really starts to highlight how difficult and challenging it is to be a tennis parent. Parents in that study spoke at length about some of the organisational challenges that they face around the finances, the time, organising coaching, organising training. But they also spoke as well at length about some of the competition demands that they faced around having to interact with their children before, during and after matches, around dealing with other parents on the sideline, about perhaps their child's opponent as well, and came up with a real list of different challenges that they faced in relation to competitions. Some of the more experienced parents also went on to speak about some developmental challenges as well, associated with perhaps their child's progress. Some of the thoughts in relation to how tennis was impacting upon their education or their broader social development as young people. And it really started to kind of emphasize to us the importance of some of the work that we're doing with parents and the need to navigate some of these stresses and challenges that parents face. What was particularly interesting is that 10 years later, in 2019, Chris and I did a follow-up study. We were again interested in the stresses that parents face, but also some of the coping strategies that they used. But what we highlighted in that study was actually the amount of stresses that parents were talking about. We identified 342 different stresses in that study alone. And I think for us, it really started to suggest actually we hadn't made too much progress in that area in terms of perhaps navigating some of those challenges. And that really caused us to have a look at how we can support the parent journey. And the first thing that we did was we started to look back at some of the early sport parent research that focused on the roles. And some of Fredericks and Eccles' work, which was published in 2004, highlighted parents' roles as being a provider of the experience, an interpreter of the experience as well, focused on actually helping their child to make sense and understand their experiences, but also be a role model as well, to know how children will learn from their parents through their observations of how they environment. And obviously, in order to fulfill those different roles, parents require quite substantial knowledge in a range of different areas, particularly in relation to the interpreter role. Parents need to understand the nature of tennis as a sport. They need to understand some of the basic principles as well around talent development, child development, and also some of the principles of sports psychology more broadly in relation to what effective communication looks like perhaps before, during and after tennis matches. And that really caused us to start thinking about how we could develop some workshops to tap into all of those areas of knowledge and pass that on to parents. But we're also conscious of this idea that actually, of course, roles change over time, and the knowledge that parents will need when they first come into the sport will evolve as perhaps their child starts to compete. And that's where we have the two separate workshops that we're going to introduce you to this afternoon. The first one being designed specifically for parents when they come into the sport, the second one being targeted at parents once their child starts competing. We've been piloting some of these studies in the UK, and we've also been evaluating their effectiveness, and that's something that's very important to us as researchers. And what our results are starting to show us is that parents are much more confident having been on the programme. They're starting to enjoy their involvement in tennis more as well. They're experiencing much more positive emotions. But also from a developmental perspective, they're starting to create environments that are much more focused on their child's personal progress, improvement and effort. So we're starting to create a much better environment, and parents are starting to enjoy their experiences more, which is all pointing to some positive changes. So now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Workshop 1, which is designed for parents when they first come into sport. After that, I'll pass on to Professor Chris Harwood, who's going to talk to you about Workshop 2, which is much more focused on optimal competition parenting. So what we're going to do this afternoon, I'm going to introduce you to the three different areas of Workshop 1. I'm going to pick out some examples of some of the tasks that we do with parents, just to give you an insight regarding what this workshop covers. The first workshop is designed to have three main sections. We look at introducing the nature of tennis as a sport, before progressing on to look at managing and organising your child's tennis, and then finally participation in talent development in sport. So focusing on section 1, what we first do, and this is obviously designed for parents when they first come into the sport, is we introduce tennis as a sport, and we start to unpack parents' knowledge of the game of tennis. So we look at how tennis originated, some of the surfaces upon which tennis is played, but also some of the rules as well for parents who don't have a prior understanding of the sport. We then progress on to look at some of the parents' reasons for involvement, and that's where we're going to give you an insight in relation to the first task. This is an example of one of the tasks that we use. It's an icebreaker task, so it's one of the first that we cover in this workshop. And it's really designed to get parents into small groups to start interacting, but most importantly to discuss how and why their child got involved in tennis. And that then brings out this second question associated with, okay, if you're bringing your child into tennis and you're supporting and providing them with that experience, why do you do that? What do you think the benefits of tennis participation are for your child? And this always evokes a really good debate and a really good discussion. And following that, we then go on to start to do the reveal in relation to some of the answers and what the research says in response to some of these points on this slide. First of all, we look at some of the benefits of physical activity among children. And of course, tennis evokes more physical activity in young people. First of all, we draw upon a study published by Chalkley et al., which was designed for Public Health England. We look at where the most evidence exists in relation to benefits of children engaging in physical activity from a physiological, psychological, social and behavioural perspective. And we look at what the research says in this area. During the workshop, we then progress on to look at what actually are the benefits associated with sport participation and tennis participation specifically, and draw upon research which has explored and compared children who do and don't compete in sport. We then finish off this task by actually looking at what some of the unique benefits of tennis are in relation to other sports. And we highlight tennis as a truly global sport, one of the few sports in which males and females can compete together, one of the few sports in which people can compete from as young as 5 years of age up to around 90 years of age. And the sort of the diversity and how tennis courts are often available in multiple countries and multiple resorts around the world. So it's a truly global sport, and I think on those levels a sport that's unrivaled. Following this, we then progress on to the second section of the workshop, which is really around your provider role. So we start to look at how you can manage and organise your child's tennis. We start off by looking at some of the levels of junior tennis and how they're different to adult tennis. We then look at adapted equipment and what's the logic and the rationale behind why children use adapted equipment. Following this, we start to explore age groups, scoring system, ratings and rankings, and of course, they will vary substantially depending on where you are in the world. We then look at how you can select a coach, so we explore some of the competencies and characteristics of effective coaches. We look at what effective coaching looks like in practice. As a parent on the sideline, what are you likely to see from effective coaches? Following that, we look at how you can build relationships and work effectively with coaches by drawing upon some of the research which has been conducted in that area. The final section then looks at how we can organise tournaments and some of the guidelines and recommendations that we provide. And I'm going to give you an insight in relation to some of the content we cover in this section. So this is an example of some of the guidelines and recommendations that we offer. And these questions really come from our experience of interacting a lot with parents over the years. And some of the questions which they always ask and always want answers in relation to. Things like, when should your child start competing? And we always think that tennis should start during tennis lessons, or sorry, competitions should start during tennis lessons. And the reason for that is because there are a range of physical, technical, tactical and psychological demands. From our experience, we know there's a lot of children who have the physical, technical and tactical ability to compete, but perhaps are not psychologically ready to cope with the demands of competition. And that can impact on their experiences. We start to unpack some of the key questions. We then go on to look at things like, how many times should your child be competing? What sort of tournaments are most appropriate based on their developmental stage? And provide advice and guidance in relation to those key areas. The final section then progresses on to look at participation and talent development in sport. First of all, we draw upon some research that's been conducted in the United States that's asked over 8,000 children what motivates them to play sport and tennis. And without giving too much away, you'll be amazed to know that actually within the top 5, none of the responses suggest that winning was the reason why they participate. We then progress on to look at talent development and the debate around whether to sample or specialise. whether it's beneficial to play multiple sports or focus on one sport from an early age. And I'm going to give you an example of the task that we do in relation to this topic. So we start to explore this idea of whether it's more beneficial to focus on one sport or whether it's more beneficial for young children to participate in multiple sports. And we know this is a question in which parents are often want support in relation to. And the popular assumption, which is often driven by media articles, is the idea that actually specialising in one sport increases the likelihood of young athletes making it to an elite level in their sport. So what we do in the workshop is we do a task where we ask parents to stand up and form a line from left to right. Those who believe that an early sampling approach, one that encourages children to participate in multiple sports and activities from an early age, should go to the left-hand side of the room, whilst those who believe in early specialisation should go to the right. And of course, we end up with a continuum. We have some people at the extremes, we have lots of people in the middle. And during the workshop, we start to explore why people stand where they do on the line from the left to the right, and what their justification and rationale for standing in certain places is. Following this task, we then start to explore what the research says in this area. And the International Society of Sports Psychology have published a consensus statement in this specific area that highlights 7 different postulates drawn upon all of the research and the evidence. And we go through them in the workshop and we start to unpack some of the complexity associated with this question, which will help you to make more informed decisions about whether you prefer your child to sample or specialise. But what I'm going to finish off today with is just the conclusion that's provided in the IOC consensus statement, which suggests that you should avoid early specialisation as diverse athletic exposure and sport sampling enhances development and athletic capacity, reduces injury risk, and increases the opportunity for a child to discover the sport or sports that he or she will enjoy and possibly excel at. Okay, so I'm now going to pass you over to Professor Chris Harwood, who's going to give you a brief overview of Workshop 2, which is titled The Optimal Competition Parenting Workshop.
Thanks, Sam. Welcome everybody to this webinar. It's so good to see so many people on the call this afternoon. When we were doing the research and the interventions with parents, one of the biggest positive feedback we got from parents was around trying to support them in the context of competition. And this is based upon the realization in tennis that often when parents go to competitions with their children, it's without a coach. So often, unless you can afford a coach to go to competition, parents are the primary caregiver and also in many respects the assistant coach to their to their child during these events. So it was important to try to provide parents with some ideas and some support in terms of helping them to manage themselves and also to give their child as optimal experiences as possible. So when we look towards Workshop 2, which is the progression for parents who are traveling or supporting a lot of their children at competitions, we're mindful of trying to introduce it through 5 different sections. I'm going to briefly go through these before spending a little bit more time on particular areas of the workshop. So we begin by talking about the nature of tennis and why it's psychologically tough, yet so useful for life skills, before also getting some information to parents about what the research says about what children want from them at competitions, what's desirable and undesirable behaviours that children say are important for parents to know. Those 2 sections really tee up the focus for the rest of the workshop or webinar, looking at the different contexts of parent support, which is the pre-match situation in terms of supporting their child, the within-match scenario as parents watching matches, and then finally, of course, the post-match scenario as well, and maybe the car drive home and the time within 24 to 48 hours of the match itself. So I just want to shine a light on a few of those particular areas so you get a flavour for some of the content of the workshop or webinar if you choose to go on it. So if you look at the first section, the first section really gets parents talking in a group, interacting, about basically why tennis is so psychologically tough. You know, what is it about the nature of the game which places demands on their children? And we have a lot of good discussion, and parents come with a lot of interesting ideas around the individual nature of the tennis. You know, it's lonely, but you're never alone. Some of the anxiety that gets provoked in the game. And it helps parents to understand some of the mental skills that are important. But it also provides us with a chance to understand some of the life skills that tennis can develop in your children. And we spent a bit of time on this particular slide where we talk through some of those particular resources that tennis can give children in terms of their own development towards moving through adolescence into adulthood. That tennis is as a sport which can help with independence development, with communication skills, with conflict resolution on the court, as well as teamwork and regulating and managing their emotion. So it gives a number of opportunities as a sport for young people to develop these particular psychosocial qualities. But we also stress that this only happens if we, as parents and as coaches, create an environment which values those particular competencies and emphasizes development in these areas. That tennis isn't just about winning, it's about the opportunity to develop some of these other life skills as we go through the different experiences of tennis that your children will have, both in the club, in competition, in training, etc. Into the second part of the workshop, which is this research on what children want from their parents, and helping parents to guess and play a game around that as part of a task in the workshop. But one of the main areas that we then go to is this focus on pre-match communication and the kind of ways in which parents can influence and support and encourage their child before going onto court, and allowing parents to explore the views of what to say or what not to say before a match, which helps them to understand the importance of what we say are process goals or values. You know, to have a values-based approach towards competition in the language that you use. So one task that we introduce in the workshop around pre-match communication is basically parents rating different examples of quotes in terms of a 1-star, very bad thing to say to a child in the build-up to a game or a match, to 5 stars, an excellent way of exchanging information or communicating with your child in a kind of a supportive way. So one of the examples, the first one we give in this example, is this particular scenario here, where the parent says, "Come on, you can beat her, you can win this, you are the better player. You've got a great draw, her ranking is low, so you shouldn't have any problem winning this one." And we ask parents in the workshop or on a webinar through the chat function, you know, what they think about that. What would they give that on a 1 to 5 scale? And most would say, well, it's probably a 1 or a 2 for lots of reasons around pressure and around the negative influence that might have on their child. And for each one, we then provide a breakdown of the analysis or the different language and the effects that it has. So we break down the quote. So winning's more important here than progress and development. That's the message that's being sent. There's a pressure which is focused on diminishing or reducing the ability of the opponent. We talk about the fact that this statement would create a very ego-involved environment because it's emphasizing comparison with someone else and comparisons of ability to another person, and a focus on having to prove yourself right now. It sets the expectation and emphasis on the outcome for a child. And this particular quote is an example of one which will probably raise anxiety in a child before a game, maybe during the match, and possibly anger in a child, of course, if they weren't meeting their parents' expectations during a game. But then we progress on to other ones and discuss some of the positives and the other things to say through the workshop. In the next section, we progress to within match management and how parents can manage themselves and cope with the stress of watching a match. Because as you know, in many respects, the parents are also a performer, sitting on the sidelines or trying to manage their own reactions and their behaviour, watching their child play. And so we actually spend some time helping parents understand stress and understanding how to cope, you know, as a parent watching. And then we spend a lot more time focusing on their body language in reactions to different match situations and helping parents to explore, well, how would you react to this particular situation and what is the kind of the best ways to react in supporting your child. So we have a task here which actually gets parents to focus on their within match body language. How are they sitting? Are they sitting openly? Are they sitting in alert and engaged? And are they reacting unemotionally to situations? So one of the examples that we asked them to do is to react or type how they would react in a match. And of course, we give different examples. So one, for example, is your child hits an easy volley into the net. And you know, parents then type or talk about how they would react. And most parents in that situation would obviously try to be encouraging, try to gesture or to help a child to understand, you know, no problem, next point, move on, keep going. Because the most important thing in that situation is indeed to help a child to focus on the very next point, because the last point's gone, you can't do anything about the mistake. And also, one of the key things is actually recognizing that the child might have actually played an exceptionally good point, but just finished with one slightly missed error, which in their mind makes up the whole point, when actually most of the point was actually very good. So helping them to move on in an encouraging way. We provide a different range of 8 scenarios for players, for parents to debate and understand what the best moves forward are. We've covered those 3 different situations, or 3 different excerpts from the workshop. And then finally, obviously the one bit that's missing there is this final situation, the post-match communication, the post-match context. Probably one of the most important ones in terms of really helping your child to squeeze the learning from an experience, regardless of winning, regardless of losing, actually help them to understand what they can learn and gain from the match itself. And we spend a number of slides talking and discussing around the skill and the timing of conversations. You know, here you see an example of Andy Murray just after losing the first Wimbledon final, and then obviously a few days later actually trying to talk through the scenario or talking through a coaching scenario with Ivan Lendl. We know that you're not going to get much out of the child in an emotional situation. So the key thing is to try to let the outcome sink in and the emotion sink out and have a more rational conversation with the child. So those are just a short glimpse into the workshops itself. I'm going to hand you back over to Miguel now, and obviously encourage you all to attend the workshops and webinars on the ITF website. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Chris and Sam, for your presentations. Excellent summary of the 2 workshops. And now let's start with your questions from the audience. We've got many many questions, and we're going to try to squeeze them in the time available we have. We're going to start now with the first question that is going to go to Sam. This question is coming from Salah from Egypt, and the question is, in your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges tennis parents face at the start of the journey?
Thanks, Miguel. Yeah, really good question. I think from my perspective, I think some of the challenges that parents face sort of during their initial involvement in the sport is appreciating the demands and the nature of tennis. I think it's often very difficult if you haven't played the game to understand how psychologically tough and challenging it is. I think the sort of second component of that is probably understanding the nature of the sport and the system. That can often be quite complex in tennis with lots of different levels and surfaces and types of competitions you can enter. And then I think the second or the final challenge there really is sort of being able to appreciate how different youth sport is to elite sport, and how the sort of priorities in youth sport are much more based upon progress, improvement, development of your single child. And the challenge there is really trying not to become too preoccupied with outcomes in them.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Now the next question goes to Chris. Very interesting one from Bruce and Sheila, a couple of parents from Australia. They are asking, what would you recommend parents and all coaches doing following this webinar, learn more about dealing with their tennis playing children? Which would be your advice on this one?
Could you ask that question again? What would be just say again, Miguel?
What do you recommend parents or coaches that they should do following this webinar to learn more about dealing with their children?
Well, I think obviously we would encourage them to obviously go on the ITF website and benefit from some of the information that exists out there for parents and actually for their children, because there's obviously quite a number of resources for parents and for kids to listen to and read. I think there are a number of other websites and more reputable sources of information that parents can go to for support. I mean, myself and Sam were involved in the Sport Parents EU project. So if parents wanted to just Google sportparent.eu, this is a website which contains a vast array of information, both for coaches and parents, around supporting their child, not just psychologically, but in terms of growth and maturation, nutrition, talent development, etc. And I think that websites like PYD Sportnet and also the Positive Coaching Alliance, those are websites as well where there's a treasure trove of advice and insights and information to parents there and coaches. Excellent.
Thank you, Chris. Second question to Sam. It's a general question. What would be your key advice to any tennis parent?
Yeah, good one. I think my sort of main advice would always be try to focus on your child's personal progress, improvement, effort. It's a phrase I often use, but I think it's often very overlooked as well, and people become preoccupied with kind of ratings and rankings and outcome. And that actually can kind of impact on their child's perceptions of competence when they go through difficult periods. You know, if they go through a bad spell of form or they get injured or they move up an age group, if all their competence is based upon how well they're doing in relation to other people, that can negatively impact on their perceptions of competence. So the way in which you can navigate around that as a safety net, you can really focus on your child's personal progress, improvement, and effort. That would be my answer.
Thank you, and thank you, Sam. So, second question to Chris. This is what are the differences in stressors that parents experience across the development of their children's tennis?
Yes, thanks, Miguel. Well, I think it goes back to some of our studies. I know Sam addressed some of this in his talk, but I think we find that in the early stages, parents are more concerned and stressed around their child's enjoyment of tennis. They want their children to have a good experience of the game, and they're obviously concerned about their child's improvement and progress. And that links to things like finding a good coach, stresses around understanding the system, how many tournaments to play, what tournaments to play. I think there's a lot of concern around fair play at a younger level as well, along helping parents helping their children having a positive experience and a respectful sporting experience as well. I think that becomes a stressor for them a lot in younger tennis. I think it progresses as they get older, as their children get stronger and maybe more competent, more confident. The stresses for parents become around their children managing their growth spurts, puberty, adolescent development, and how they can help their child supported during the injury, or when they grow so much that suddenly their game starts to struggle a bit because of technical changes. That can be sometimes very difficult during adolescence. And also the balance between school education and tennis becomes a really important one for parents, because they're trying to support their child in tennis, but at the same time ensure that their child's educational future is looked after, and that kind of discussion with the coach around the best ways of optimizing both scenarios becomes much more of a concern, I think, as they head towards sort of 14, 15 years of age, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. Next question to Sam from Assis, who's asking, how do you keep teenagers engaged with the sport as they get sidetracked by challenges of the times?
Yeah, good question. And obviously kind of, there's a big dropout around adolescence. So this is a really important question that we often spend a lot of time trying to consider. I think ultimately you have to look at kind of the developmental changes and what sort of young people are looking to get out of their involvement in the sport at that period of time. Peers become more important at that stage, parents become less important. We know that from some of the developmental research. So I think it's important to make sure that actually their tennis experience maps on to perhaps what they're looking for as well, in terms of closer connections with coaches and peers, rather than just kind of focusing on individual training all the way through adolescence. I also think that it's a little bit about promoting autonomy and ownership as well, and making sure that young people have a say in what they're doing. So I think that's kind of a key element, particularly during adolescence, because we know that young people always want more involvement, they want more independence. So if you involve them in sort of decision making around, how much tennis they want to be doing, how much training they should be engaging in, but also what type of training, whether it's individual or sort of group work, then I think that's going to be pretty important in terms of keeping them engaged in sport.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so Chris, this one is a classic one, and it comes from the Philippines, from Paul Silmaro. He's asking about the parent-coach scenario. He's saying, due to familiarity between a son and a father relationship, being parent and coach at the same time, is it better to hand over the training to a dedicated coach? What do you think?
I mean, I think that the really important, initiative between a father-coach son, relationship is managing that separation between being a father away from tennis and being a coach on the court, and really making a real effort to being a father first in non-tennis situations. If it ever seeps over, if the dual role begins to be compromised, I think that it puts the son-father relationship in real jeopardy in that sense. So I think it's an important conversation between between father and son around what type of support the son needs with respect to their tennis, and what type of support the son needs with respect to their father. And the father being very open to having an honest, unbiased conversation about the benefits and advantages and disadvantages of both different roles that the father is playing there, and for the son not to feel guilty if it actually, he says, you know, look, I think it might be better if I transition to a more expert person here and allow you as my dad to be kind of the safe haven, the emotional support, the person who's looking after me away from the work on the court. But I would definitely say that, of course, you know, fathers need to maintain involvement in that situation, because it would be a transition and not an easy one to go to an expert coach. But I think it just depends that, and the son has to be really honest and be allowed to be honest with their father.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. So this one is for Sam. It comes from Brazil, from Cesar Kiss, and he's asking, in 10 and under tournaments, do you recommend that boys and girls compete separately, or they can play together? What do you think?
Yeah, another good question. I think it's pretty common, certainly sort of mini tennis and 10s and under, that boys and girls will play together. And I guess that's often dictated by the amount of people who turn up to the tournament. So it's certainly a common occurrence across the world. I think from a psychological perspective, the main thing is that actually to make sure that people are going to be competitive in the tournament in which they enter. I think that's the priority. Up until probably sort of early adolescence and puberty, I think boys and girls can compete together on a similar level, but it's obviously dependent upon, you know, the sort of the skill set of the child at that point. So yes, before puberty, it can happen, but I think ultimately it's about parents deciding which tournaments are most appropriate for their child based on their level of competence at that point in time, to make sure that actually their experience is a good one.
Excellent. Thank you, Sam. Now over to Chris. This question is, as a coach, what is the best way to handle an overly involved and overly competitive parent that is affecting the child, and that actually starts competing in everything she does in and out of the court, and doing everything, including cheating, to win, even in simple practice challenges?
Well, that's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, the way I work as a psychologist with new coaches, well, new parents, and supporting the coach is, I actually really emphasise to parents the understanding of the mental skills required, you know, to support their child in tennis, and the ways in which we need to help children, if they're going to be successful, have a really broad identity. So it's not just about a child defining themselves as a success purely by winning and winning alone, that they have other particular psychological and social skills that they're being able to grow into, that they are developing, and they are valued for through tennis. So when the person, and when I say the self, goes onto court, it goes onto court with a lot of positive qualities in terms of facing competition. It's not going onto court thinking, I've got to win this, because winning is critical, and that's the only thing that matters. Because if they don't win, then the self crumbles, or there's basically no sense to the self.
Yeah.
And with that particular parent, I would probably say, if you behave like that, then the consequences are going to be really high levels of anxiety in your child over time, and real fragility of confidence in your child when they start facing stronger opposition, because they're going to be defining themselves that way without any backup of a stronger identity which you've helped them to develop. So I'm pretty straight with parents nowadays. I might have been less so as a younger psychologist, but as an older psychologist, I'm pretty direct in terms of the physiological, technical, talent consequences of being a parent like that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris. And talking about talent, we've got a question here. To Sam, because he spoke about talent development, and the question is, which aspects would you emphasize in your consideration on definition of talent when we talk about talent development?
Yeah, I guess you've kind of got the two components here, haven't you? You've got the sort of biological, the physiological aspects of talent, hand-eye coordination, you know, genetic things around muscle fiber, sort of development. But I guess from a psychological perspective, the way in which we always look at it is, okay, what are the kind of the characteristics of people who are sort of developing optimally and making it to an elite level? So they're the things we're particularly interested in. They're the things ultimately we can do things about as psychologists, and we can try and create the right environments to develop some of those characteristics. And in many ways, a lot of the work Chris and I do is kind of built upon some of those principles, and drawing upon the research which is explored kind of at various developmental stages, what sort of characteristics do elite athletes have, and how we can build environments to try and develop them.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you very much, Sam. So this one comes from Chile, and is for Chris. Is Fernando Perez is asking, which one is the moment when the family has to make the decision about tennis for their kid? If it's just an entertainment or it can be something more competitive, do you think it has to come from the kid or from the parents, or what do you think about that specific period, which is very crucial?
Yeah, good question. I mean, well, I think first and foremost, if you look at players who want to maybe progress onto more the high performance pathway, and then have a chance of progressing to high levels of the game, whatever that level might be, but to high levels, then I honestly do think that it has to come from the child, and they have to have, very, very good high levels of intrinsic motivation. That they have to, want to be playing tennis and living and breathing tennis. I think if they are, ready to make that, or ready to make that decision. So I would definitely say that the decision to go more competitive or on that pathway is the child, and you have to see if the child does have that intrinsic hunger. I think a coach can help you with that decision as well, whether the child does have that. Just because it's such a difficult sport to make it all the way, that passion is really important to have. At what age? I mean, again, I think that tennis is getting to be an older sport now. I think that kids need to stay focused and motivated on at least, I guess that one sport probably from 14, 15 years of age. I think people specialize a lot earlier than that, I know. But I think that some people prove that you can actually make it in tennis a little bit later on. But definitely, I guess specializing more, from 14, 15 upwards is probably the time when that comes into it.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. So this one goes for Sam, and it's Warren Lee who's asking, because you spoke about specialization. So when you indicated that the children should play a few sports at young age before specializing in tennis, how young do you mean before a kid would specialize?
Yeah, I guess this builds on some of the things that Chris was talking about, and for me, it always I always refer back to Jean Cote's model here, who built probably one of the most kind of well-cited models of talent development. And it really had 3 stages, and the sampling stage was up from about 6 to 12 years of age. So I think that's particularly important during those phases that children participate in multiple sports, and also start to find the sport in which they probably most enjoy, but also are showing sort of most development and most improvement in. And then start to specialize around the kind of 13 to 15 years of age. As they start to develop, they have to sort of lose some sports to focus on others. Doesn't necessarily have to be one, it can be sort of 1 or 2 at that point. But ultimately, the model suggests sort of by around 16, 17 years of age, they really need to start investing in one sport, and starting to engage in much more of a sort of structured training program in order to sort of make it to an elite level. That obviously sort of is drawing upon athletes who made it to an elite level from multiple sports. I don't think we have a model specific to tennis just yet, but it's certainly a very useful starting point to sample up to around 12 years of age, start to specialize between 13 and 15, and then start to invest around 16 years of age.
Excellent. Thank you, Sam. Now this one comes from India, from Shankar, and goes to Chris. How do we identify the child is really passionate towards tennis, irrespective of rankings or success rate? Is the success rate of the kid an indicator? What do you think?
Well, actually, I don't think success rate is an indication of passion at an early age. I think success rate might be an indication of early levels of promise or early levels of talent, which, of course, as Sam has pointed out earlier, actually it's more around developing that talent or through a positive environment, which makes that difference. I would actually say that identifying a child as really passionate is when they actually aren't successful, or when is in their response to matches they've lost, for example. And we see how kids want to go and train, for example, straight after a match, or are eager and willing to go down to the club and want to spend time working on their weaknesses as well as working on their strengths with their friends. So kids who love watching tennis as well, actually, that's an important sign of a potentially passionate player, a person who likes to get into the tactics in the game as well and discuss the match situations and game styles of players. Then you've got a player who's kind of into the more intellectual aspects of the game, which is so important. So I think all those types of behaviour are kind of indicative of someone who has a degree of kind of intrinsic motivation. They're going to play tennis irrespective of the prize or not, type of thing.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. So let's go to the last round of questions. Last question for each one. So we'll need kind of a quick answers if possible. This question is for Sam. Matt is asking, for 10 and under kids, which do you think is the best ratio of coaching? One-on-one, group coaching, match play, or you think that also could be advisable more casual father-daughter rallying? What do you think about this?
Yeah, difficult to put a number on that. I guess looking at that, or the specific components of that question, I'd say group coaching should probably be around 50%. I think that's particularly important to make sure that children enjoy their tennis experience and interact with other children. And the emphasis is often kind of on fun and enjoyment in group coaching, perhaps more than individual coaching. I would then say probably the rest of the 50% could be split between sort of one-on-one coaching, where the child's going to be given probably more specific components to work on and improve. And then also 25% as well of the kind of the casual father-daughter rallying, which I think, if done well, is really enjoyable.
Excellent. Thank you, Sam. So this is the final question, the question for Chris. And Michelle is asking, how would you support a player who struggles with mental game during tournaments?
Okay, that's a good question again. Well, I think for me as a psychologist, the first thing I would try to do is observe and try to understand what's going on at tournaments. So, and that wouldn't necessarily be about what we see in terms of their behaviour or their mental and emotional responses within a match situation. It would include how well they're preparing for their matches as well. So I'd be looking at what's the quality of their pre-match routine, which might well be a factor in their in-match performance mentally. So, you know, are they preparing mentally? Do they have clear goals? How are they supported to try to help themselves get into the right mindset in a way which helps their confidence and their relaxation and composure going into a game? So I'd be interested in looking at their pre-match preparation because often players don't have good pre-match routines. And at that level in the match, I'd probably be interested in looking at what their between points or within match responses are. So what is going on here in terms of their management of themselves in between points? Because I need to find kind of evidence of what the player is struggling with, what the player is doing, what the player isn't doing so far, which can then help them with strategies. And I probably would also look around at the coach and the parents to see, are there any other external factors which I need to know about, which could be influencing the child's mentality and their thoughts and feelings in tennis going into matches, because that could be quite important to look at.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris and Sam, for your answers. And now, yes, as highlighted earlier, we would like you to go through a feedback form and please provide us feedback on the ITF Tennis Parents webinar today. So following the end of this session, you will be requested to complete a very short webinar feedback via the ITF Academy. Please do complete this as it will allow the ITF to plan for future webinars and courses. So again, Chris and Sam, thank you very much for your presentations, and also thank you very much for the different views and opinions that you have provided to all our attendants today, which we think that will be very valuable to all attending. Finally, many thanks also to the ITF staff for their excellent organization, and to all parents and coaches and other interested people for taking part in this webinar. We really do hope that you have enjoyed it and learned new aspects that you might be able to apply to assist in your child tennis journey. As we said, we suggest you to take the courses in the ITF Academy to improve your tennis parenting skills. Many thanks again to all, and best regards. Take care.